that just to welcome everybody to Drinking Water 2024 in Wales. Great pleasure to see you. Such a great program as well. Brilliant that we have people who are come and listening to drinking water quality. Can you not hear me? Bit more volume, please. Right, can you provide your feedback? That's too much. Right, let's see. Can you hear me at the back now? Are you okay with it in the back? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's great to get a sound check there. Thank you very much for that. So I was just saying it's great to see great around here. We had a great last week as well, particularly since we're talking about drinking water. I really truly believe that drinking water is essential to our society and our societal needs, and we really need to make sure that our drinking water remains at a very high level and quality. So it was working a second ago. Oh, there we go. So starting off with some of the industry statistics, Welsh Water and Avon and Albion Eco supply 3.3 million people. That's about just under 1/20th of the population of England and Wales. And that's quite an interesting statistic when you look at the statistics overall in Wales. And I'm sure those of you and all of you from Wales realise that at 394 reservoirs and 69 of treatment works, that actually you have about 1/10 of the surface reservoirs of the industry as a whole, when you think about the average. And similarly, you have about 1/10 of the mains, because there's about 300,000, 330,000 kilometres of mains. And that creates some special problems in Wales, because whilst you're only supplying about 20 of the population, you have about 10 of the assets. You have twice the number of assets in the population. Creates some issues. The other interesting thing I think that I noticed here, and it was similarly industry-wide, is the number of treatment works from our report last year has gone down by 3%, 3.2%. And the number of service reservoirs actually has gone down by just over 4%. And the industry has gone down by about 3%. And that's a really interesting number. That doesn't mean those service reservoirs have just disappeared. It means they've been put out of use for a period of time. They may come back in use. It is actually quite a relevant number when you think about it, for 4.2%. That's a reduction in reservoirs. Very interesting overall. When we think about the overall statistics in Wales, we have great compliance here at 99.7%. As I was talking to people out there, there was general sentiment about how good our water quality is. When you think about that there are something like 250,000 analyses and only around 70 or thereabouts failures, it's really, really fantastic water quality. We don't celebrate how good that water quality is enough, and we focus too much on the negative aspect. Now, one of the problems is of a regulator is that you often do focus on the negative aspects, because that's the one thing you're there to improve the company. So those things that I'm going to talk about are those really rare things where we're trying to talk to the company to do better. Okay? Not because you're not doing well at the moment, it's to get us to work and be better and stay ahead of the world in our water quality, because we do it so well. So when I'm thinking about the things like the compliance risk index, that's about getting us to do things better. And the median compliance risk index is 1.7. That's actually going down from the industry. So what we're seeing is it's those half the companies on the right hand side of that median are improving. And in terms of the mean, we're seeing a few companies bringing that mean up. But I'll explain why the mean is going up and the median is going down. Overall in Wales, here we've reported 53 events, or companies in Wales have reported 53, and we've completed 53 on this chart. There are about 57 overall for the whole year. What's interesting in Wales is we've seen quite a rise in the minor, because it's overall we've seen a significant rise in reported events. That doesn't mean more things are going wrong. It means there's better dialogue between ourselves and the water companies, so there's a greater transparency and we can understand how we work cooperatively. But this is significant. It's increased about 5 times, 4 or 5 times. So we've seen about 4 or 5 significant events this year. We've seen about 21, and that's not all in the company's control. We've also seen a rise in water safety planning risk index, a rise in recommendations, a rise in instruments, and in Wales, obviously, a rise in transformation from 0 to 1. So overall, we've seen these statistics rise from last year in our dashboard. Just focusing on the compliance, and it's worth just spending a bit of time. We have 75 tests which have failed, and that's really consistent for Wales. You tend to see year on year between the high 60s and the mid 70s, year on year, where this failure is really consistent. And the mean zone value on the percentage compliant always sticks around 99.96 to 99.97, depending on rounding. Okay, so we've seen a small number of increase from last year in terms of number of failures, but the central compliance is improved. So it's about the same. We've seen that stay the same for about 2 decades, which demonstrates a high quality water. This kind of breaks down all of those failures that we see. And it's quite interesting to see that 27, we go through them all and say, well, which ones are the companies, which ones are not the companies? And we see 27 which are not due to the domestic distribution system. That works out about 36% in Wales. For England, it's about 50%, but less so in Wales. Now, is that positive or negative for Wales? Well, I kind of think it's a bit positive actually, because the investigations are getting better in Wales. And so what we're starting to understand is some of the root causes of some of those fails. And that's particularly the case around taste and odour. So there's a dozen failures in taste and odour. And usually when you look at taste and odour and the compliance failures, most people just say, oh, it's the domestic distribution system, and whatnot. But in there, you've got 6 failures which are just due to one block. So 6 zones. Half of those failures are due to one zone alone. And that was really interesting because this particular zone, when you look in Wales, keeps repeating. You go back over the years and you keep seeing it fail. I think you can go back about 5 years and you see about 15 fails on that side, and you see the same thing. And there was a bit of a sort of a eureka moment with this zone, and it came in about 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic. And I remember sort of sitting there going, oh, this is interesting, because all the samples were being taken from reservoirs at the time. And up until that time, all the investigation was saying, oh, it's the distribution system, whatnot. This failure is the one zone in 2021, which was in the reservoir, couldn't have come from the domestic distribution zone, could it? So, the question is, well, if that's the case, where is it coming from? Now, at that time, it was said it was geosmin. Okay. But actually, when you look at it, and the company have really done a good investigation here, the root issue seems to be trichloroethylene. And so this zone has an upstream issue, which is causing a repeat failure time and time again. So those half dozen, we can't say the domestic distribution system. And the other thing that we're seeing is we're seeing a rise in MIB. So we've seen a couple of pages on MIB. In fact, when I looked at all of those, I was really struggling even to find one which I thought that really is the domestic distribution sector system. All of them were upstream. So normally I'd go, oh, that's the domestic distribution system. In this case, none of them. Okay. We've got 30 coliform bacteria here, and about only 5 of them couldn't be attributed to domestic distribution system, but probably are. But it's really telling how important this taste and odour is. It's such an important science point, okay? Because it tells you so much about it, and the more you think about it, the more you investigate, you can understand the challenges. So this is kind of telling us, actually, we've got some problems coming upstream, from upstream. So we've got algal loading. Sometimes that doesn't, the biomass for the algae doesn't equal things like MIB and Josman and so on. But the company are really suffering, and we're going to see that as a future problem. That is a future issue of climate change. As the temperature gets better, or not better, whether it's better, but when the climate change increases, and it's predicted to 2080 that there'll be a 2-degree increase, that MIB and Josman is going to really go. You can see more and more taste and odours in that area. So that's a future strategy, isn't it, that we have to deal with. But there's something else as well, isn't there, about taste and odours and what it tells us, because it's almost our sensory perception of our water. This is what tells us there's something wrong. So we had some really interesting taste and odours. So, for instance, we had a customer in the Marston zone who rang up the company and said, look, I've got a bit of a sewage taste in my drinking water. So this is not compliance, it's just someone ringing up the company, I've got a bit of a sewage taste. Can you come and have a bit of a check of it? And they go along and they go, well, I can't taste anything. And they take a sample, don't they? And they've got Clostridium perfringens, and they've got Clostridium perfringens, maybe there's something wrong here. So they go back, and sure enough, there's a problem. So this initial taste and odour complained by the customer has led, the perception of a sense has led the fittings inspectors from the company to go, we need to investigate a bit more. And they've gone to the property, and guess what they found? They found a squirrel in the dinner tank. Okay. Now, it's not unusual. It's not that unusual. We have found pigeons before. Or companies that found pigeons, because people just don't cover their heads of tanks. They, with box of flat screens that feeds the water supply, and they've not put a cover on it. Schools of pigeons get in. The poor squirrel has drowned to death, and it's then donated everything within itself into your water supply. So there's something really important about fittings and fittings inspections. And if you're a company, you've got to start thinking about, how do I support my fittings inspectors? And some guy in Barry Leisure Centre goes, my water tastes a bit chemical, doesn't it? I'll give the company a ring. What does the company do? It goes, we'll go out and we'll have a look at that. Has a bit of a swig of the water and goes, you're right. Better send the fittings guys out to here. And sure enough, they go there, and guess what's happened? They've cross-connected with the heating system. So they've got the cleaning chemicals in the heating system in their drinking water supply in a leisure centre. Wow, that's a public building. It's a public building. And you're drinking those chemicals because somebody hasn't taken care of their plumbing. So you need qualified plumbers, which I know somebody will be really pleased to hear. You should have qualified plumbers to stop cross connections. And future risk, if we're thinking about future risk, and we're thinking about reuse and recycling, we've got to get this right. We really got to get this right. First time, we've got to get it right. Okay, so also taste and odour, brilliant. With another event, what's it? Isopropyl methylpyrazine, ethoxypyrazine. I just call it IMB or whatever it is, IMPI, IIP, and that's come from upstream contamination. Somebody's got an idea, they're going to have a sort of on-farm ice cream dispenser, milkshake dispenser, except they tap into the surface drainage. Okay? And part of this is a byproduct of things like actinomyces, streptomyces, yeast, and so on, which produces this, isopropanol, glucoxypyrazine. And if you like wine and you like coffee, you'll know that potato taste. And that's exactly what that is. You can detect that down to 2 nanograms per litre. Okay? And all that took was somebody to use your surface drainage for their disposal, which has then caused the problem in the drinking water. And it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen that with EDD, resin manufacturer. But this, for those of you who are old enough to remember the Wen incident in the 90s, the North East London incident in 2011, where you could detect down single nanograms, and particularly young people who were able to taste these off flavours, could taste it in our drinking water. So it's really important because they reject the water. And we've seen that here again. Now, we also see other things such as nickel and colour. The colour here, that relates to a concessionary supply. Yes, we still have them, whereby somebody is given a supply which is effectively raw water, which has like a UV and filter. But the problem here is that when it becomes coloured, the filter and the UV, one, the filter doesn't work, so your undersink filter really doesn't take out colour. And the other thing is that the more colour you have, the less effective your UV is. Okay, so what's the company doing here? They're serving a notice on the individual to boil no water. You can't have that for a long time, so we've served a notice on the company for that. Nickel, I keep talking about, there's our shiny taps that we have, and the lead here normally is supply pipes. This, in fact, was a comms pipe, this particular lead. Okay, and that's why so many of these failures belong to the company rather than an individual. Most of them tend to be the supply pipes. And another really good example of lead, not in compliance, when I think about it, is a lead failure, which a company took in 2022. They went out and took a lead post-lead pipe replacement sample, detected lead, mentioned it to the company, went back a month later, took another sample, 4,885 micrograms per litre. That is 100 times more. So, more than that, isn't it? 500 times more than the limit. And somebody is drinking over a long period of time lead in their drinking water, giving them advice to run their tap, doing nothing else but giving them advice to run the tap. Year later, realising that the zone is actually now non-phosphate because it was a rezoning activity, which changed it from a phosphate zone to a non-phosphate zone, and you've put people at risk because you now have a lead zone in the non-phosphate zone. So actually, the risk of removing phosphate from the dosing is that you can end up with substantial levels of lead, and we need to be mindful about what we're doing, what those risks present. Now, from a good news point of view, there are no E. coli failures in water treatment works, no E. coli failures in water reservoirs, none at all. It's brilliant. There is 100% compliance, but there is no indicator of fecal contamination, and that is a real feature in wells. We don't see that. We don't see E. coli years since E. coli reservoir. So it is, very positive. Sometimes things change, but in 2024, we haven't had any E. coli failures in water treatment works and reservoirs, and that's brilliant. 14 failures overall between water treatment works and service reservoirs. The 2 in the water treatment works, quite interesting because they were in tanks in service reservoirs, and the companies couldn't remove the tanks. So they had to use a remote operating vehicle to get in to the tank. And in one tank, actually, you had the baffles, which kind of stopped the ROV being able to inspect that tank. So there needs to be contingency built in because you're running a residual risk and you can't get into those tanks. Similarly, when you look at the coliform failures of reservoirs, 3/4 of them on the later inspection had some kind of ingress. And we've been talking about this for a number of years about reservoirs. It's why are we being so focused on reservoirs, 3/4 of ingress. So, you know, we've had all sorts of things with reservoirs, so knotweed, root intrusion, overgrowth, structural failures. And when you have a coliform failure, it's an opportunity to check that. It doesn't mean that the ingress is necessarily then coliform, but it does give you an indication that something needs to be done. So in those cases, you know, the companies have become very proactive in removing them from supply, doing the flood testing, working out the leakage, and then fixing that, because that's what drives down these coliform failures. So there's a well done there. Okay. Look, I want to contrast it against private supplies because, again, it's about trying to put context on our public supplies, which are really good, and the private supplies, which are really not that good. Because here we have something like 9% of private supplies of people indicate of people contaminations, 1 in 11. 1 in 11. 67,000 people here are supplied by a private supply. That means 6,000 people are long-term drinking fecally contaminated water. Lovely. Okay. That's the state. That's 2% of people in Wales. And we're not really improving. Okay, we improve by margins. But overall, people are drinking their B&Bs, their farm properties and so on, private supplies, which are fecally contaminated. And we have taste and odours there, lead, turbidity, manganese, aluminium, and all the rest, and all those other things. And that's a real problem because, you know, never mind about the risks that fecal contamination does in private supplies. There are other risks. So here we have an example of supply. This is not in Wales, this particular one. So it's such a good example. I thought I'd share it with those in Wales, where there's arsenic, okay, in a supply, up to 60 micrograms. It's mad. 60 micrograms, okay? If you're on a long-term supply of arsenic at 60 micrograms and you're a smoker, you have a pretty high chance of cancer, okay? Because you have two factors which are adding to your health outcomes. So that is really serious. So what does the local authority trying to do? Well, what they're doing is they say, well, you know, we need to put that on public supply. So it's switched between public and private supply. You can sort of see the cycle of arsenic going on. And they turn around and they say, well, you know, we need some on-site treatment and so on. And the reality is these under-sink treatments don't work. Okay, they just don't work. And clearly, in this instance, they weren't working. So the solution here was to get it on the public supply. So there's a real lesson there. If you've got a private supply of this kind of thing, you need to get it onto a good quality, clean public supply. The other thing, actually, is these regulation-aid supplies, which are quite interesting, because these are relevant to water companies. So this is the supply that takes water company water and sells it on. Okay, now if you're a new entrant and variant, you're licensed and you sell that on. So that's a legal arrangement. Okay. But if you're an individual, like a farmer, and you sell that to a caravan site, that's a Reg 8 supply. It's an onward supply. Now, that's been illegal since 2002. Okay? And actually, you know, but nobody kind of tells people that. And I don't know, someone pointed out to me Clarkson's Farm, which I have to admit to, I don't watch that one that very I have to stop myself there for a second. But actually, I did watch those couple of episodes because it was about him opening a pub and he had a cesspit which hadn't been inspected since the 80s, and it all cracked up and it was polluting the environment. And his water supply was a private water supply, which he openly admitted he couldn't use because it wasn't fit for consumption. So he did a deal with the local farmer. and he tapped into his public supply, into his pub, and guess what happened? The local town, not only did the local town run out of water, but his pub ran out of water at peak time. So he had to close the pub down because he didn't have enough water for the toilets. Now, he was making a bit of a joke out of it, it's quite serious actually, because this hasn't been in the control of the water companies, an onward supply, and the company will get blamed for the sufficiency or the insufficiency, and they'll also get blamed for the leakage. Okay? And yet, this has been something that's been completely by somebody in his name. 2010, it was a requirement for the local authorities to regulate onward supplies, even though the onward supply was illegal. So now it's illegal, but you have to regulate the onward supply in 2010. And what's more, in 2006, Ofwat produced guidance on charging for an illegal supply. So the water charging guidance in 2006, it sets out what you can charge for something. It's like turning around to a local store and saying, you know, those vapes, those single-use vapes that are illegal, actually, this is what we charge for them. Okay? So that's an interesting arrangement. Now, all of these are going on all at the same time. So you've got Heathrow, housing developments, dual pipe systems, temporary events, which are all on the supplies and they're all impacting. So there's something about water companies working with local authorities to be in control of their water supply, how much is going up, particularly as, you know, our water usage increases over time as people generally tend to, it's warm and the water usage goes up, okay? And there's all these supplies here, all the private supplies that are going out because of drought, using water companies' supply and charging for it. Okay, so let's talk about, let's go back to Wales overall and compliance risk index. And that sort of, you kind of think, God, that, you know, you can't really work out what's going on. Is this the compliance risk index? And we have, you know, nearly 10 here, down to 5 and then up to 7, down to 4. And you think this is mad, okay? So this is Welsh water. You kind of think this is mad. And I hate statistics which sound mad. So I kind of think I can't make sense of this. What's going on with Welsh water? You know, why are they having such a bad time here with such high CRI, way above the industry? Is this a massive risk that I need to be worried about? As my strategy in dealing with the company, is it not working? You know, the company just ignore me, which I know they're not. They're the only people that kind of listen to. Nobody else listens to. Water companies do listen to. Okay, which is a good thing. Okay, so I asked my team, I said, look, can we separate out the legal instruments from that and see what's really happening, what's happening underneath these figures? And that's what we did. And lo and behold, we have a completely different picture. It's really positive. So what we're seeing here, and this is only my interpretation, but hopefully, okay, here's the massive one at 9, okay, and the legal instruments are the blue and no legal instruments. So you had a really bad year here in 2021, okay, coliforms and so on, it was. But actually, we sat down and we had a bit of a chat about this, and we've got a lot of legal instruments in, and what's happened is they can't keep listing. So we've seen the inherent underlying risk go down, and that's really clear. Okay, and that's green shoots. Okay, that's saying not only are the company listing, but they're doing something about it. What's happening here is the activity of DWI. Okay, so this would be PR24. This will be transformation. Okay, particularly because we're concentrating on coliforms, PR24, iron. Okay, so that is what's happening. This is the activity of DWI, and that relationship between DWI and the company is what's driving these green bars, these green shoots. So not just green bars, they are green shoots. So that's really positive about what's happening. It's really important to expose what's happening underneath in some of the statistics. Okay, now if you look at this, it looks, you know, you come back up here and you kind of think, well, as a company that's supplying about 3 million people or thereabouts, you'd expect them to be down there. And if you took the legal instruments, in fact, they would be way down here. So actually, you'd be well under 2, and you'd be doing well. But the purpose of the legal instruments is to drive those green shoots, and that really is purposeful regulation in that respect. Okay, so we can sort of tease out those compliance, and I've talked a lot about compliance, so I won't go into too much detail. But what we're seeing here is this iron, which is very characteristic. So we've got iron and manganese, 5-6%, 37 or 8%, that's 43%. That's really characteristic. That's the underlying problem for Welsh Water. I talk about it every year. It is the underlying problem, and it's linked to the amount of networks that the company. So, for instance, if I was looking at Welsh Water and I said, well, you have about 65 compliance failures, okay, and I compared Welsh Water with Affinity Water, who have less than 40. It's the same size company. They have 2/3 of the compliance failures at Welsh Water. Okay. But the circumstances are a bit different because you're dealing with that much more money. So you have to say what is consistent for Welsh Water, but it is the iron. Here we're starting to see the taste and odour coming in. That's the saltney taste. So isopropyl methoxypyrazine is what that is. Okay, and we can see quite a large portion here, and that's down to having in that respect. The taste, odour, iron and manganese largely down to Welsh Water, and the coliform you'll see will be where's the gratin up here, which is driving that. Okay, so that's really typical picture now of Welsh Water, and that's really the focus that we want to have on with the company. Okay, so let's talk about events. So there were 43, which have been 53, which have been 57 here, which have been the reported number over the year. And you have to sort of look at this and you kind of think, well, what's going on here? We've got 18 in the customer distribution system. That works out about 30%. Okay, something with what's happening in customer distribution, that's 30%. We've got third-party damage 3 here, ground contamination spillage 9. You work that out, it's about 50%. So 50% of events are caused by people other than the water company. Half the events are half is 50. Okay, that's quite interesting. And what's interesting is, I mean, it's always great learning because you think about ground contamination and spillage. And there's a great example in Welsh in a place called, I think it's St. Asaph, which, I mean, that was a brilliant investigation by the company because what's happened is somebody's run up, and I've talked about taking this. My water tastes like petrol. It's awful. Company go out and they go, oh God, you know, you're right. It tastes a bit like. How's that happened? Well, it's only BT who's been outside, isn't it? And they sort of dug a big hole and then they've got a telegraph pole. They've cut a load of coal tar in the bottom to preserve the telegraph pole. They put a few railway sleepers around plants and whatnot. And that coal tar seeped into the ground. It's contaminated the ground. And that's worked its way through to the blue pipe, the MDP, medium density polyethylene, and it's percolated through. And that small amount of coal tar has tainted somebody's drinking water enough to perceive. And that's what the company has to deal with. Now, there was a lot of missed opportunity when I look back 2020, I think, where the company could have seen it. That's why I think I'm saying the investigations are getting better. Because that's a great example of going out and thinking actually about what has caused this taste, what's outside. You know, somebody been dumping their benzene on the ground. No, it's Openreach or whoever it was digging telegraph poles. Somebody else causing an effect on the drink. Brilliant example. Love that one. Enjoy reading it. I'm a bit sad on that. Okay. Now, this is unusual because it's the first time Havant have overtaken Welsh Water in events. Usually we see white noise in Wales at quite low levels, and this is down to saltney, taste and odour. Such a big event, this because it affected not just Havant, it affected Severn, it affected mostly United Utilities. I think Havant were a little bit sure in terms of the way they reacted, because they only had about 4 complaints in the beginning. Well, it hasn't really hit our targets. You kind of miss what was a really good learning point. These kind of very low nanogram contaminants in the ground, they're real opportunities to understand what's going on. So they hadn't reported it. So we had to turn around and go, why haven't we reported this? Oh, it hasn't hit our target of 5. But of course, by then we've lost all the data. We can't really go back and we can't really find that data. And so in that way, Havant's been a bit, it could have done better, I think, is the term that comes to mind. It could have done better. We lost some valuable information there to help ensure and secure our future water supply. Okay, so just breaking those down and looking for common themes. These are the 10 most events we've had. I think I've done something tasting over to death there, but it's really worth talking about. Other tasting owners, Taliban. Here we've got MIB, algal byproduct, 180 nanograms per litre. This one was, which far superseded expectations. Expectations for the plant, more than ever seen before in that particular raw water. And that really gives us an understanding of what the future holds for us. And we see that MIB up here, Glasgow, and we keep seeing these taste and odours, which I've talked about before, for algae. And then we've got this works here, turbidity, and here we've got 174, 175 millimetres of rain all in one go. Okay? And the company are doing what we're asking them to do. We're saying, we want you to take the tanks out. So they take one tank out and we've got the other tank. Huge amount of rain comes along and the turbidity goes up. And we go, oh, what's happened here? What's going on? By the time they get the tank out, they suddenly realise there's a big leak in the tank. Okay? And that's what's driving the turbidity. So we're seeing heavy rain, climate change outcomes, even in turbidity. We've got the Newtown lake, which I talked about. And then we've got a series of burst mains and loss of supply and a reservoir issue. And so there are a few of these I want to feature and just talk a little bit more about in this area. So I want to talk about this particular one. And the reason is the damage. So this is basically digging for a wastewater contractors, and they fracture the main. It's not the first time we've seen that. It happens more frequently. The issue here, I think, is the risk that this poses. So you're working on wastewater and you fracture a drinking water. And that's a real risk, the potential cross-contamination. And for me, I'm quite bothered about that. But I think there's something about the loss of supplies and the reactive audit and the alternative supplies, which is the theme that we're seeing in Wales with alternative supplies, particularly when we're sending out tankers and we're not sampling those tankers, or we're not controlling the bottled water, or we haven't sufficient controls. And that's a recurrent theme as we go through Welsh Water around alternative supplies and how the assurance is managed there. I think in one incident, and I'll talk about it later, 396 deployments from 27 tanks. Make 9 samples. Doesn't quite stack up. Next one here is the Cavendish air valve. I've been kind of banging on that air valve all year. Okay, so this is really interesting because this is a 12-inch main, so it's not an insignificant main here. It's gone through farmland. The farmer's been flowing over the top and they've sheared it off, okay? And this is classified by company as not high risk. Wow. Okay, what is high risk? How much more high risk could you be than having a pipeline going through farmland, a 12-inch trunk main? Now, there are I think it's Water UK guidance around air valves, and that doesn't necessarily. What it says is that you don't have to necessarily take care of in interest in the manufacturers and instructions or guidance. Really, it's a bit like having my car and it's saying my camera needs changing after 75,000 miles, and I just go, I forget that. I'll just sort of not do it, and I'll think about that 90,000, 100,000 miles, and my car breaks down. Okay, so guidance for manufacturers is really important. Risk assessment is really important, and where the risk is really important, and this really exemplifies why that risk is important. It's one of the best industry cases of where a non-critical valve should be critical. I'll come back to it once again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about service reservoirs. And this is those which haven't been, the green line represents those reservoirs that haven't been inspected in the last 10 years. Now, 10 years is the max. You shouldn't have a reservoir that hasn't been inspected for at least 10 years. I would say you have to do it a bit more frequently, particularly if you're dealing with a risk-based methodology. So, is it more risky? How often do I do it? But here we have a number. And then we have Havering down here and Welsh Water, which has a nice green line right on the flat there. Okay, so we can have a quick look at that, and that means for Welsh Water we've gone from around 4.6 32 tanks to no tanks. Yeah, I wonder if that's equal to the number of reservoirs that are not in supply by chance. Okay, now it's not. No. Okay. So how much contribution is it for the tanks that are not in supply? Don't know. Okay, but I think when you bring back tanks in supply, and as you go over 10 years, maybe that will be bounce back. Prove me wrong. Show me that you stay at zero. I'd love you to stay at zero so that we reduce our risk. So there's a challenge to you. Next year, I'd love to see that value at zero. Havering, you're lagging. You're even lagging behind the industry. You're at 6%. The industry average is 3%. Okay? So you need to do better because actually you've just gone, well, 5 tanks, 7 tanks. It's a small number of tanks, but nevertheless, you're still behind the industry. Okay, why does it matter? Okay. Why does it matter about reservoirs and what we do about inspecting them? Okay, we talked about root ingress, we talked about knotweed, we talked about finding things that you don't expect to be there. Look, it's not unusual. This year we found a bird in the outlet on company because they got through a grill and they got stuck in the outlet. And that caused a problem. In another company, we found 4 or 5 rodents under the membrane. They got them way under the membrane in a tank, and so they were living on the top of the tank. Really hard to stop this. Now, here we've got a tank that was built in 1915, and it didn't have a roof 40, 50 years ago. Actually, you'd be thinking, that's mad. But actually, I've actually been to one of these, not in this country. I went to another European country, sort of advanced European country. I was kind of helping them out a couple of decades ago. And their capital city had a water treatment works. And I said, well, what's that body of water? Oh, that's our service reservoir. As I was watching the seagulls flying overhead, systematically pooping into what was treated water. Okay? European capital was feeding a third of the population. It's standing to you are almost having excreted there. You are joking that this is the service, but this was normal. This wasn't unusual. Now, it's unsurprising if you have an open body of water that something's going to happen. You're going to have some kind of animal that's going to go along there and it's going to swim and it's going to drown, and that's what's happened here. And in this instance, it's a dog. Okay, which is probably drowned out maybe 50 years ago or something like that. But it's come along, it's covered over the reservoir and hasn't hasn't inspected that in 100 years. Okay. So was it, the reservoir's out of use? Okay. So is there any risk? No. How long ago was that risk? It was probably some number of decades ago. Is it likely to present a risk while it was in supply? Look, probably not. Okay, it probably did at the time, you know, because there was no way a dog was going to get in there without that roof being off. You know, so you know you are talking decades old, but it really exemplifies the point about reservoirs. I had spoken about this particular reservoir because it was the oldest reservoir in the industry that hadn't been inspected. And by God, it should have been. And there's a lesson there, and there's a lesson for the industry. Make sure that all your reservoirs are inspected, particularly at the time. Okay, so we look, to be fair, we've really focused on Wales this year and last year, and you've seen it by the legal instruments and so on. And we've done quite a number of audits here because we've been quite interested. So, for instance, we went to the call centre. Really interesting that because I was reading it, because what they were saying was that the advice from the call centre is your water's safe to drink. And then they say, I don't expect you to drink in the same sentence. Now, what does that say to a consumer? Yeah. What am I supposed to believe? Is it okay? I know what they're trying to say. You know, you've got a bit of discarded water and you're saying it's safe to drink. So you're trying to say to people it's okay. You've got a bit of drink and there's been a bit of iron and manganese there. Okay, and it's safe, it's safe, you know, it hasn't harmed you. But then saying I wouldn't expect the people to then get the wrong idea. So you either say at this point it's not safe to drink, you should not drink it, it's a do not drink, do not use. So you have to be quite definitive about your messaging. And certainly that's what we found about your the call centre or mixed messages in that call centre, particularly when that communication has to be absolutely on key. Then we've been out to Flindry, Bryn Cowled, and the drinking water safety plan. Look, that's quite interesting. That was a big audit to read. That was about 55 pages, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading. It was very detailed and it had about 50 or 55. It was about a recommendation page on it. But really, it covered a lot of different subjects. And in particular, it talked about some of those things such as air valves, like your risk assessments. What's underlying the risk assessment? Does it line up with what you're doing? Because what we want is we want that risk assessment to be a live document. We want you to respond to those risks, to mitigate those risks proactively. Okay, so line by line, we went through that risk assessment. It didn't line up necessarily with the prioritisation of the company, with the mitigations of the company, or some of the objectives, you know, of what should be done. But more importantly, it also looked at some of the other areas and looked at the air valves. And this is an air valve that they came across, which is soil in it, and sheep droppings around, and that's presented a cheese hole ready to have to align and cause really big insults. Okay, that air valve wasn't a priority in that audit. Okay. So really interesting. I'll just explain some of the other audits. So we went out to 4 service reservoirs in Havron. Look, generally they're quite good. They were quite good. The team were quite impressed with it. So it was a well done to Havron in that respect. But one of the things that we started to do with our teams, we started to use a cross-fertilisation. You know, what's happening with security and so on. So here we've got some contractors come along for, we don't want people walking up the top of that because it presents a risk, but actually that's a gap. So that fence is useless. It's totally useless because you just fit past that. So why bother putting the fence at all? Why bother finishing? You haven't finished, it's half the job, isn't it? I've talked also a lot about MIB and taste and odour. And one of the things is that we've seen high levels of MIB treatment works on 3 occasions, at least, in Welsh Water where they haven't been able to code. the treatment works in terms of GAC, even with the additional PAC dosing on top of that. And here we've got phalendry works. Okay, so just to spell it out for you, the GAC regeneration date 9 years, the maximum set by the companies. So that audit was done mid 2024. That means there shouldn't be any GAC older than 2015. As you can see, we've got one here, 2010. That's 5 years overdue for GAC. Now, if MIB hits that works, that's not going to work. You know, you've got 6 of your filters, 6 out of 14 of your filters are not optimal or potentially optimal. And so we found that in other works as well. So the GAC management got to do better. Absolutely got to do better. Again, just focusing on this particular works because here we've got temporary dosing in a makeshift bund. The risk here, of course, is sodium hypochlorite. Can you imagine the temperatures last week? That sodium hypochlorite sitting there, you can have loads of chlorate there because it will break down. So there's no control here. You have got an alarm going off on your chloride alarm, which is saying the validation's failed. Okay? That's not connected to the control room. So nobody in the control room knows that. That's got to be someone happens to be walking past to realise that that validation's failed. Nothing's alarming around chlorine. Okay. Here we've got a bund. Again, improper storage. That bund is just not enough in terms of holding any spillage in. And here we've got a hatch with a convenient rope to pull the ladder down, which is crossing the seal of the hatch there. So actually, the whole point of the hatch is to stop any leakage going in or any flooding to go in. You've got a rope there and they're transgressing them. And in other reservoirs, we've seen single skin hatch as well. So, there are real issues here. Some of the issues around just the impact on the concrete where it's starting to leak, the GAC feed water going down by the clean water tank, which was leaking. So that presents another risk. So there are a whole lot of risks on this side waiting to happen. Infrastructure, sodium hypochlorite, alarms, hatches, water leaking from feeds, water feeds. It's only one of those to have another issue, and that becomes a major incident. And that's the team, what they found inside. So we've got to do better. Okay, look, I can't avoid but talk about the bottle store here. So this is not Welsh water. Okay, so this is the alternative supplies for drinking water by bottles in a warehouse. Okay, now if I was the supermarket and I was storing bottled water, I wouldn't expect it to be in a shed made of asbestos with holes in the roof, a door that doesn't close, allowing pigeons and the like to go in and to put guano all over the floor. My inspectors went there and they were slipping on it, literally. This is water intended for human consumption. So you can see all the bird guano and the way that the bottles have been thrown in. That is no way to have alternative supplies. Potentially is supplying areas in Wales. What could have been supplying areas in Wales? That's shocking. It's food. Can you imagine what the heat on that shed is doing to that plastic and the leaching of what chemicals in there? Never mind about the bacteriological Cryptococcus neoformans is what comes to mind. The bird one. It's a serious microbe. So you can't have that. Got to do better. In fact, the company has done better because I like when a company goes, we got it wrong, and now we've got a nice, smart bottle store. Okay. Look, I want to quickly talk about discoloration. Okay, so Welsh water, you're really not going anywhere at all in terms of discoloration. This discussion that we've had year on year on year, and it's why we have so many notices. Avon, look, you have improved over the last couple of decades. You got rid of the seeding plant that was causing the problem, but Welsh water, you still have source waters which are high in iron. You still have problems with old iron mains, and you still have problems in terms of stagnation. Every time you have a burst main, you have discoloration, and some of these burst mains have, will create discoloration, iron, manganese, aluminium. I think even one of them had nickel in the discoloration. Okay, so just looking at the discoloration in 2024, particularly with Welsh water, we asked Welsh water in our Reg 24 notice to meet 1.4 here. You're at 1.8. So you haven't even made those notices. In fact, 3 of those zone specific notes you push back into the next step. So there's been no progress whatsoever. The company is way above the industry average. I mean, the nearest competitor is 1.3, so you're 0.5 higher. So that's very substantial, and you've not made any improvement. You've got to do better there, because the number, every time you have a burst main, every time you have new mobilisation, you're impacting your customers. And similarly, taste and odour, again, we're seeing a slowdown here, coming up to 0.4. So both discoloration and taste and odour are increasing. So the companies are going backwards rather than forwards. So you've got to do better discoloration. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about recommendations. So this is the first point of contact between regulator and the company. And we can see here the number of recommendations are going up. Now, this is not unusual, actually. If you think, God, this is really bad, actually, when you look at the industry, we're also seeing the recommendations going up. So this is very reflective of what DWI is doing, because that's the first level intervention where we're producing recommendations. Overall in the industry, there are about 830 recommendations, and here we've got about 123. So that's more than 1/8. So if I was even allowing for 1/10 of the names, I would expect a little bit less recommendation. That is a little bit harsh, because if you look down here, what we've got is we've got something like 70 recommendations around audit. And of course, we've had about 50, 52, 53 recommendations alone on the risk assessment audit. And so that is what's caused all of it. Okay. What you would have seen is something a bit more like this, had that audit not happened. So that's real activity from DWI that's driven this bottom bar up. This is quite similar, and you've probably done actually a bit better in terms of compliance, and we can see how much better the company's doing in terms of compliance and how they're doing in terms of events and how those investigations are being positive. But it is showing the amount of activity that we're doing in the companies is quite substantial. And that perhaps is causing some discomfort for the water companies, but it's quite important to keep driving that improvement. Okay, and you can see here the vast majority are going up to Welsh water. Nevertheless, that's a real quite a sum for Hammer. When you think about it, you're 67,000 people only. So you're 36 times more, 36 times smaller than Welsh water. So you might argue that should be 1/36. So if I was thinking that, I'd be expecting about 3 or 4 recommendations here. I might argue the same about compliance as well. You would argue that if you're 1/36 of the size of Welsh water picked up 65 recommendations, you should only have 2. Two compliance figures. And you've got about 10 on there. So you're underperforming. So it might look like Haddon's doing well, but you're not. So I don't want to keep bashing Welsh water because I've got to bash heaven that happening a bit as well. Doesn't mean you're not doing too bad. I'm just saying you've got to do better. And that's what we're about. We're trying to create improvement within the industry. And actually, that's then driven Welsh water up into this region here. If you look at the whole of industry, there's only one other company, I think, which is Southern Water, and they're on the way down. So you can, and that's what's causing so much activity. So I have a team of about 4 inspectors. So that's hugely disproportionate for the company spending time on Welsh water. I've got 4 inspectors just looking at Welsh water. We should only really have maybe 1, maybe 2. We do spend a lot of time. So again, I would say, look, we can see the green shoots happening. What I'd quite like to do is to see that come down. Hopefully the transformation program may cause you pain in CRI and whatnot, but we'll hopefully see that dry down, particularly if we can get those risk assessments sorted out. And we can actually look at that because 62% of those are around management, and then 42% are around risk assessment. Now that's unsurprising because we've really focused on that, and we've done an audit on the risk assessment. So it's a really brilliant audit when you read it. I encourage you to read that audit. It's long, but it's a really great audit because it goes into detail from everything about infrastructure, assets, compliance, risk lines, individual parameters. Very impressive audit. Great piece of work by my inspectors. And that is what's driving that. And the reason we're driving this is because we want companies to focus on a drinking water safety plan. The reason we want on the drinking water safety plan is because we don't want those cheese holes to align. We want all those risks to be mitigated wherever reasonably possible. So if you have a high risk air valve, that's inspected regularly. Where you have potential upstream contaminants, that's mitigated. And that's really driving that strategy from DWI. Okay. Overall, when we look at the recommendations by category for the industry, okay, that's not recommendations, this is the recommendations risk index, okay, where the companies identify their risks and they categorise those. So category A is where the risk has been mitigated, category E is where there's a risk being identified, but no action has been taken. And then it works down D, that there's unidentified mitigation, plan being put in place and being delivered before it's fully verified. And then that ultimately drives an understanding of where we are in terms of residual risk. So we have about a residual risk of 15, where there's either the risk hasn't been mitigated or still in process of being mitigated, where things potentially could go wrong. Now we're in the real world, that's never going to be 0. Things go wrong, industrial accidents happen, planes come out of the sky. What we want to do is to drive that down, but we also want companies to realise where those risks are. So it's a real sort of dichotomy, isn't it? We don't want 0, but we want to make sure that companies are aware of what those risks are. And I think overall in the industry, we do have that recognition. So certainly where companies sort of it's almost like the alcoholic going, I'm an alcoholic and I need to do something about it rather than just saying I'm not. Here we have a recognition that there's actually more risk than we thought. And I think that's probably a fair assertion. And I think we see that across most of the companies where they're saying we need to spend a bit of time. So up here we have Northumbrian Water where they put the HAZREV in place, hazard review, and they've gone through risk by risk by risk. And they go, God, we've actually got more risks than we thought. And that's a mature thing because it's acceptance that things are not perfect. Okay. So actually, I see that as positive, that there's self-recognition and that strategy is working and driving. We can see working through the green shoots. I think for Havering, the scale is quite different. So if you go back, you can see that's 26. Havering has quite, what is it? It's about 100 or thereabouts. So it's about 4 times the risk at the moment. I think that's quite a mature outlook. And when we looked at that, and when Severn Trent took over, they really had a bit of a think about where those risks, and they sort of took everything apart and said, there's real risks here, we need to deal with it. And I think where we're seeing here is they've been through the storming, and they're going into the norming now. So we're getting those risks under control. So we're starting to see that corner being turned, and that's really good. So that's some advanced thinking, and we're all to see that happen in Wales. I think we're starting to, we should be still seeing some exposure of those residual risks over the next year or two. So if we look at the risks, we can see that the vast majority of risks under the current risk assessment is no supply. So we're really worried about our resilience in our treatment works and our networks, about what that means, loss of supply and so on. And that's why we're really interested. There's a real understanding in Wales about privileged bridging, and I think that's very historical from 2005 and wetlands. So there's really embedded knowledge, and that's really important in the company to have embedded knowledge, to have that understanding. You can't forget wetland in 2005. You have to have that knowledge and those people who have retained that knowledge. And all those other things that we love. Manganese iron clearly is a risk, and our E. coli and turbidity. That makes all sense to me for Wales, to the industry overall. And if we look at the future risks, because we have a category I, and we said, well, what do you think are your future risks? And we've asked the industry. So this is not Wales specific, but we can still see, so for a number of companies, particularly to the east and the south of England, nitrates are a real problem for industrial farming. We're seeing the rise in nitrate, no supply in terms of sufficiency and resilience is a real concern. And PFAS, obviously, is a real concern these days in terms of those forever chemicals. So that makes a lot of sense, and it gives us a real strategy of where we need to go. It gives the DWI a real sense of where we need to go as a regulator to drive the industry to be better. Okay, so we can talk a bit about PFAS. Now, overall in the industry, last year, 750,000 analysis were done for PFAS. In Wales, 30,000. This is a really interesting area for us. We have produced guidance, and we're really interested in how we deal with this and how we mitigate this. And one of the things that's been quite interesting is to see what the EPA did in the United States, because they said, well, we're interested in PFOS and PFOA, and we're going to have a 10 microgram limit, and we've got 4 others that we're interested in, and we're going to have sort of single figure nanogram levels. In fact, that's been rolled back now by the administration, and they announced in June that they're rolling that back, and we're starting. They're now saying we're just interested in PFOS and PFOA. The others we're not going to really take that much notice of, and we're going to expect you to monitor up until 2030 once they push that back. Now, as an industry within England and Wales, not only have we done that monitoring, so the United States, who've been held up as the pinnacle of what a PFAS standard should be, haven't even done their monitoring. They've now pushed that back 2 years to 2031. The industry here has not only learned how to do the analysis, they've done the monitoring. So we've got nearly 5 years worth of data, 1.7 million data points on PFAS. So we have a really good understanding of that monitoring. And in the industry, England and Wales, we see that there's about 21% PFOS in the raw water, okay? And then we see that flip over to PFBS in the treated water. Now here in Wales, actually the raw water is about 28% PFBS. So that's that shorter chain PFAS. Okay, and one of the theories that I have in terms of England is that if you have a slightly longer chain, you have a GAC which is effective in that maybe you're selecting out the shorter chain because that's getting through some of the GACs, because not all the GACs are that effective, or as effective as they might be. But here in Wales, the ground pollution probably looks like the newer PFAS rather than the older PFOS, PFOA. Having said that, from the raw water, we only have 6 6 detections in the tier 2 and none in the final water. One of the strategies for DWI was to have a systematic reduction strategy to get us to tier 1. That's 10 nanograms. So Wales are in a really good position in terms of where they are with PFAS and what that means for the consuming public. Because actually, whilst we have 21 species found in the raw water, the strategy for the administration really has to be how do we deal with that pollution, environmental pollution, what those companies are that are polluting to stop the future hazard. The water industry has done their bit because they've identified it and they've removed it or diluted it. And yet the industry's had to pay for that. Doing that. And the water industry is very much in a position, somebody else's problem has resulted in the industry having to fix it because there's an expectation. Okay, just going to enforcements, where we go now. This is slightly different to when we look at the national picture, because the national picture, there's a real correlation between the 28 4 notice and AMP8, and there's a big cluster in that box. So both the risk assessment and the AMP8 for business plans. Where's my risks? What do I need to put in my business plan? That's what the strategy is. In Wales, we've got it not linked to AMP, the transformation programme, and the AMP8, which is just roughly even throughout the notice, and that really relates to those risks being identified. That's a little bit different from the industry, but actually that's quite mature, because what we want is we want to see a company identifying those risks rather than having this 5-year lumpy period and thinking, I've got to rush to the business planning. So what we saw nationally is around 2021, 2022, a massive rush to get notices in place ahead of the business planning process. That's not how it works. Much more mature, much more steady. Nice to see, actually. So it's a well done in that respect. Okay, I've got to talk about Regulation 31. Look, there's a real purpose for Regulation 31 because what we want to make sure is that we want to ensure the products that are in the supply and distribution do meet the requirements of Regulation 31. We don't want them flaking off as a pipe underwater. You wouldn't want that in your water supply at all. Or your paint flaking up in big chunks, dropping down onto your reservoir floor. So this is a pipe that's in a reservoir. It's a natural pipe. It's a real photograph. That wasn't Regulation 31 approved. The company got it wrong. Okay. We got it wrong. Because that should never have got to that point. Okay. Now, it's actually in Wales, if you look at Wales, it is a great example of reservoir Prosar, I think it is. Prosar. Okay. Helps people can pronounce properly, unlike me. So, there's an issue there in that particular reservoir. You've detected coliforms, you've rightly taken it out of use. You've remediated it, there's been a bit of ingress in there, you've remediated it, you've coated it with concrete, okay? And then there's pH measurement, and the pH has gone up to pH 10, okay? And the company's gone, oh, there's pH 10 there, we can't put that into supply. Now, my inspector said, well, what's going on here? So we've had to ask the company. We said, what's going on? Is that Reg 31? Was it applying properly? And some of the records were a little bit patchy and a little bit sparse, but we've eventually got there. The main thing is that the company didn't put that into supply, and so it's not a regulatory breach. So the lesson here was about checking the compliance for Regulation 31 and the testing to ensure that that meets it, because we know that concrete needs curing and soaking over a period of time to allow that leachate to come out, because it will push the pH out, and that's exactly what happened. Now, once that's had the time to cure and to leach out, then that's fine. You can put that into supply. So the company got it right. So some of the paperwork and technicalities they didn't, but in terms of getting it right, protecting the products, exactly what they did, and they weren't in the same position. So the winner's sitting there going, there's no breach of regulation. Could have done better. There's no breach of regulation, and that's fine. So well done, getting that right. You can see the pressure that DWI has been putting on the industry. We have really been putting pressure on Regulation 30. And it's like, it's out of the box, isn't it? Because suddenly people realise, I mean, it makes you wonder how many products were Regulation 31. But suddenly we're now seeing this rise, exponential rise in applications for Reg 31. And it's just, quite surprising because you've got to think, well, where were those 113 down here? Were they in supply? Now, I mean, we've had a couple of examples, Reg 31. So we had one where a company suddenly realised out of the blue that their product was no longer approved, and they go, oh, we're going to send in an application quickly. So it's the usual phone call we get. We get a call and say, our products, can you do our Reg 31 approval tomorrow for us? Now, we can't do that. In all best will in the world, we just don't have the people to do that, and so on. Anyway, we tried to advise you. We got this one sorted, and we sent it back. And then, a little bit later, they came back to us and go, you know what? We gave you the wrong information. Actually, it wasn't the same product. It was a different product. And so we had to send out elected industry saying, revoked. That product was revoked because you cannot told us the whole truth, whether it was intentional or not, you not told the truth. And we've got another example there where companies just changed their name. They've been taken over by now. And so the registration is not in the right name. So companies can't go up and say, was this registered? Because it's a different name. So we've had to do that application. So part of that is driving this regulation process. So to do that, we've had to recruit a couple of double team from massive number of 2 to 4 to deal with all these hundreds of applications that we've been getting. And we've appointed the Reg 4 approved testing over laboratories under the water fittings regulations to do the BS 6290 testing over testing to alleviate some of that. Nevertheless, we still haven't sorted out the industry's responsibility in terms of their duty to make sure that products are fully tested. So this is the leachate, which needs a GCMS scan because the only laboratory was sold off that did that. The other commercial laboratory didn't think it was a commercially viable thing. So we ended up with no laboratories to do that full Reg 31 testing. And I think there was a missed opportunity because the industry was probably asleep down here. We could see it's asleep down in 2019. Nobody's having any applications. It isn't until everybody's woken up. That's why it's not profitable. It's profitable now, but it's too late because they're underneath the laboratories. So I think, the companies really need to put their hands in the pocket and to help out solve this. And we haven't. Okay, look, just talking a little bit about the water strategy, because, I've had really been quite fortunate in that I've spoken to the Deputy First Prime Minister in Wales and the Minister for Water in England. And I've been explaining, look, we really need to sort out these water supply regulations. Actually, they were only amended in 2016, so they weren't, a full regulatory set, and it goes all the way back to 2000, the regulations, and 2007 amendment, 2016 amendment. We need to update that. We need to think about forever chemicals. We need to think about the new entrants and variants because they are only some in small zones, which actually seems a bit mad because you've got new infrastructure and we have small housing estates. So actually, why are you doing all these samples as if it was a 100,000 zone? So there's something needs to be sorted out there. We need to talk about regulatory reach. So I said, look, if you have a direct procurement contract, design, build, operate, this company is not a licensed undertaker. DWI has no power to regulate whatsoever. So the regulations need to be resolved, and I wrote to the minister, both ministers, to say I need to do that. And I also wrote about sufficiency and resilience, and you'll see that because the risk assessment is saying no supply. We see infrastructure depletion, rise in risk, and we're seeing loss of supply and the consequential outcomes of that because of the lack of resilience, particularly for Wales in its network banks. The network banks, which are assets, are not appropriately considered. So we need to consider sufficiency and resilience secondary legislation. So that we set out what the expectations are, because companies don't know what those expectations are. and that needs to be sorted out from a financial regulatory point of view as well around that. And the resources and recycling, this is the pressure on our resources, particularly as we need to go down recycling, because the likelihood of people reducing their water when it's so cheap is pretty small when we have extra demand in industry, when we could be using water for industry. Actually, that doesn't need to be drinking water. So what I've said is that we need to put a secondary piece of legislation around recycled water so that we get it right first time and we don't have those cross connections like we saw in the Bowie Leisure Centre, etc. Particularly if we've got secondary systems in. Really important. We don't want to put people's lives at risk, particularly if we're having untreated water and they're saying it's okay to shower in. We're going to have so much Legionella going on where that's going to be a real crisis. So, okay, to do that, the water supply regulations, we appointed an expert group who advised us. They produced reports on our website. We've advised the minister's aware of that. We've moved them over to resource and recycling, and we're forming that group up so that there's a clear guidance and we'll get that guidance ahead of the regulations, because the regulations seem to be quite likely around that. And we don't know when that schedule will be, so we need to wait. But that's kind of the strategy that I've been talking about, and I've been talking about to ministers that I'd quite like to get going. And I think that ends that. So